I was standing in the shadows of the boardroom, watching through the cracked door as my own father prepared to sign away my grandfather's entire legacy to a group of predatory private equity vultures, and I realized that I was the only person in the world who could stop him. Imagine sitting in a room, watching your parents admit total defeat, knowing that you hold a $9 billion secret that could either save them or let them crash and burn as a lesson they'd never forget. Was I wrong for letting them sweat until the very last second? Or would you have let the people who kicked you out for being a failure realize their mistake the hard way? Let me take you back to where this all began, because to understand why I was standing in that hallway with a portfolio worth more than my father's entire life's work, you have to understand the kind of people my parents, Richard and Eleanor, really are. Growing up, our dinner table wasn't a place for sharing stories about school. It was a boardroom, light where my performance was tracked on a metaphorical spreadsheet. My father ran Sterling Global, a massive logistics and shipping empire founded by my grandfather, and he viewed me as nothing more than a potential successor who was constantly underperforming. I wasn't interested in shipping routes or port logistics back then. I was a tech nerd, a kid who spent his nights coding and studying emerging markets while my father screamed about real assets like steel and oil. The breaking point came when I was 22. I had developed a small algorithmic trading bot and needed a modest investment to scale it. But when I approached my father, he laughed in my face, telling me that I was chasing magic internet money and that I'd never amount to anything if I didn't get my head out of the clouds. That night, after a massive blow-up where he called me a disappointment to the family name, my mother stood by him and told me that maybe it was time I moved out and learned what the real world was like without their safety net. They didn't just cut me off, they erased me. I left with a single suitcase and my laptop, moving into a cramped, windowless studio apartment while working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. But I never stopped coding. While they were busy attending galas and expanding their physical fleet, I was pouring every cent I had into the very magic money my father despised. I got into the crypto space early, but more importantly, I used my algorithm to play the high-frequency trading markets. It wasn't overnight, but within 5 years, my little project had turned into a private investment fund that was growing at an exponential rate. I operated through a series of shell companies and anonymous trusts because I didn't want the fame. I wanted the freedom. By the time I was 30, I was the ghost of Greenwich, an anonymous entity that major banks were terrified of, and my net worth had ballooned into the billions. Meanwhile, Sterling Global was dying. My father had over-leveraged the company to buy out a competitor right before a global supply chain crisis hit, and the interest on their loans was eating them alive. They were desperate. They needed a massive cash infusion, and there was only one fund in the world with the liquid capital and the risk appetite to bail them out, my fund. They had no idea that Aegis Holdings was actually their failure of a son. I watched from afar as their stock price plummeted, and they began searching for an anonymous investor who had been quietly buying up their debt. I was that investor. I had been systematically purchasing their distressed bonds for pennies on the dollar until I effectively owned the rights to their entire headquarters and half their fleet. They reached out to my legal team dozens of times, begging for a meeting with the principal investor to negotiate a restructuring. I ignored them for months, letting the tension build, watching my father age 10 years in 10 weeks on the news. I saw my mother on a business segment looking pale and tired, defending a company that was days away from bankruptcy. I felt a twinge of guilt, but then I remembered the night they told me I wasn't worth the family name. I decided that if I was going to save them, it was going to be on my terms, and they were going to have to see exactly who was holding the leash. So that's the situation I was in, and I had to make a choice. I was sitting on $9 billion in assets and the legal power to strip my parents of everything they owned. Before I tell you what happened when I finally opened that door, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have saved them out of loyalty, or would you have let the firm collapse to teach them a lesson? I really want to know if I'm the villain here. The morning of the final board meeting arrived, and the atmosphere in the Sterling Global building was like a funeral. My parents were seated at the head of a long mahogany table, surrounded by lawyers and the vultures from the private equity firm who were ready to sign the papers to liquidate the company. My father looked broken. He was holding a pen, his hand shaking slightly, as he prepared to sign over the keys to his father's legacy. The lead lawyer for the vultures was smirking, already dreaming of the commissions he'd make from gutting the company. That's when I walked in. I wasn't wearing a suit. I was in a hoodie and jeans, looking exactly like the disappointment they had kicked out years ago. The security tried to stop me, but I held up a single gold, embossed card that identified me as the sole proprietor of Aegis Holdings. The room went dead silent. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and my father dropped his pen, the ink staining the very contract that would have ended him. I didn't say a word at first. I just walked to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table and sat down. My father finally found his voice, stammering out my name, asking what I was doing there. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that I wasn't there as his son. I was there as his primary creditor and the majority shareholder of his debt. I pulled out a tablet and showed them the real-time valuation of my holdings, $9 billion in liquid assets and controlled equity. The lawyers for the equity firm started shouting, but I silenced them by tossing a cease and desist on the table. I had already bought their lead bank's participation in the loan. I told my father that I would save the company, but on one condition. He and my mother had to retire immediately, and they had to sign over all voting rights to me. I wasn't doing it to be cruel. I was doing it because they had proven they couldn't lead in the modern world. The silence that followed was heavy. My father looked at the papers, then at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes other than disappointment. I saw respect, mixed with a crushing sense of irony. He realized that the magic money he mocked was the only thing keeping him from the street. They signed. They had no choice. Afterward, in the quiet of the empty boardroom, my mother tried to hug me, crying about how proud she was. I stepped back, not out of hate, but because I needed them to understand that their pride was a day late and $9 billion short. I saved the firm, I saved the employees' jobs, and I kept the family name on the building, but the relationship was permanently changed. I'm the boss now, and they're living on a pension provided by the son they thought would never amount to anything. It's a strange feeling, having everything you ever wanted but realizing the cost was the family dynamic you can never go back to. I guess the moral of the story is that success is the best revenge, but it's also a very lonely place to be. If you think I did the right thing by taking over the company and forcing them out, like this video to let me know I'm not the bad guy. If you think I should have just forgiven them and let them keep their titles, tell me why in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about people getting exactly what they deserve, and share your final thoughts on this whole mess below. I'll see you all in the next story.